Okay, good Shabbos.
Shabbos.
And Happy New Year. 2024, the door will open. Are you guys having a good New Year? I don't know what to say. Shana Tova, I guess. May you be written and sealed. Santa's Book of Life. I don't know. What do you say in the Gregorian year? I've got no idea what to say. But anyway, Happy New Year. Good to you guys anyway. I hope you guys had a good break during this time. I just got back. Me and my family were able to spend this last week at the Hartebeespoort Dam to go spend a little time there next to the river. We were sleeping there next to the river for a few days. And when you sleep next to a river or a dam, it's very interesting to listen to the noises that you hear at night. The animals that are up all night long making noises. And one of the most prominent noises you'll hear at night when you're sleeping close to a body of water is, of course, the frogs. The frogs, all right? So I brought a little frog with today. I don't know why. It seems to be a theme with me. I like to bring my son's Hanukkah presents here to the Wort table. But frogs, all right? So we were hearing frogs all night long. It was riveting stuff. What sound does a frog make? Why do you say that? Do you know that only one type of frog in the world makes that sound? It's the one that lives close to Hollywood. This is why we all think a frog makes the sound ribbit, because those Hollywood frogs are the ones that go ribbit, ribbit. I always make different sounds and different croaks, but I guess, okay, ribbit is the one that we're all familiar with. Now, if you have to hear that ribbit in the night when you're on holiday, sometimes it's nice to hear it once in a while, right? But if there's too many of them over and over again at the same time all night long, it becomes a little bit irritating. Okay, so thank goodness they eventually stop. What's the Hebrew word for a frog? Anyone know? We say it 3 times on Pesach, on the Seder. Tsefardeya, tsefardim, there we go. A frog is a tsefardeya. So on Pesach night, we dip our finger into the wine, right? And 3 times, first we start off with blood, dum, 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 which is also a mnemonic for letting you know that all the plagues are coming. And then the second one is tsefardeya, tsefardeya, tsefardeya. Now one of our rabbis, Rabbi Avigdor Miller, comes along and tells us the name of the frog in Hebrew is a contraction of 2 words. Tsefardeya is 2 words put together. First of all, tzofar, which is the name for the morning. It's not as popular as the word boker, but it's the second most used word for morning. Tzofar and yodeya. Yodeya means to know, like our name is Lada'at Hashem, the root word is yodeya, to know. Which means the frog is called, it knows when it's morning. Meaning it knows when to shut up. That's why that frog gets its name from in Hebrew. It knows when to keep its mouth shut. And thank goodness for that, eventually it will stop croaking. Okay, at least it's supposed to stop croaking. So this week's parasha, hopefully you guys have read it. You should all be familiar with it. Parashat Vaera. We start off with the first 7 of the 10 plagues in this week's parasha. And if you read the parasha, you'll notice there were frogs over here, frogs over there, frogs pretty much everywhere in this week's parasha. In fact, they teach this song to the kids at preschool. Judah taught me the song last year that they sing, "One morning Pharaoh looked in his bed, there were frogs in his bed and frogs on his head. Frogs on his nose and frogs on his toes. Frogs here, frogs there, frogs were jumping everywhere, even in his underwear." Okay, taught you guys a new song there. We'll be adding that to our liturgy just before the Aleinu. Okay, so let's talk about the frogs today and the frogs in this week's parasha. Now, when it comes to these frogs, Rabbi Akiva brings forth a very popular commentary you guys might have heard. He points out that when the Torah talks about the frogs, it used the word that Gert used there, tsefardeim, which is plural. Right? He said, "I'm going to send frogs, and you people will be disgusted by them." But when the actual act of the miracle comes, when the frogs are supposed to come out of the water, then it says tsefardeya in the singular. So Rabbi Akiva brings us this midrash in the Talmud, and he says, it teaches us that when it came to the miracle and the plague of the frogs, only one frog emerged from the Nile River. A giant frog. Right? Let's call it Frogzilla. And this giant frog came out, and the Egyptians got scared. So this is specifically from the idea that in the Hebrew it talks about it in the singular. Now the Midrash tells us what they did then, because the Torah says there were frogs everywhere, right? Frogs in the bed and frogs in his head. So how can it be only one frog? The Midrash tells us when they saw this one giant frogzilla, they came up and tried to strike it. They hit the frog. And every time they hit the frog, it spewed out another frog. So now they had 2 frogs. What are you going to do if you've got 2 giant frogs? They decided to hit it again. And that one once again spewed out another frog. And this was a never-ending cycle. The more you eat them, the more they multiplied. And before you know it, the entire Egypt was full. Because what's the first thing you do when you see a giant frog attacking you? You smack it. And then, oh, there you go. It multiplies. Now, there's a very easy solution to stop this plague, you would think. Don't flog the frog. Right? Just do that and you're simply out of the plague. It's not a problem anymore. They're going to stop multiplying. But, we have to forgive the Egyptians. They were living in denial. Okay. So, there's a lesson in this, by the way. I'm just giving this as an intro story. There's a lesson in this about anger management as well. Right? It doesn't always help you out to lash out in angerment. And in child rearing as well. It's not always a good thing to smash your children whenever they do something bad. Eventually, when you give them a hiding, and you do not spare them the rod too much, sometimes it even turns out to make them even more worse and worse and worse. So there's this little lesson hidden in there as well. I'll let you know how that works one day. Okay, so what happens is the frogs come out and Moshe and Aaron do this miracle in front of Pharaoh and his magicians. And what do the magicians do? They, of course, copied it as well. They also made frogs come forth from the water. Now, the Talmud actually tells us that the Egyptians considered frogs as demonic forces. Demonic spirits would actually use frogs as a medium to come into this world. So that means that these magicians of Pharaoh were very well trained when it came to frogs because they were magicians. This was their bread and butter. This is what they did all day long. This was before we could pull a rabbit from the hat. They used to use frogs and their demonic powers for doing magical things in Egypt. So they were very well versed and knowing how to dabble a bit with frogs. This is maybe why when we go to the book of Revelations, and we read about Revelation chapter 16, which is a good read during this week where we're reading the plagues. You look at all these bowls that are getting poured out. It sounds very much like the plagues of Egypt all over again. I want to read to you guys what it says here regarding the sixth bowl that gets poured out. Revelation 16, verse 12. The sixth bowl got poured out on the great river Euphrates, and its water dried up, in order to prepare the way for the kings from the east. And I saw 3 unclean spirits that looked like frogs. They came from the mouth of the dragon, from the mouth of the beast, and from the mouth of the false prophet. Now imagine you're a first century Jew who knows this midrash that Rabbi Akiva was quoting about them striking the frog and another frog came out of the mouth, another frog came out of the mouth, and you hear John write this in a letter to you guys about the revelation. Immediately you're coming back to this story of what's happening here at Pesach. Verse 14. They're miracle-working demonic spirits which go out to the kings of the whole world, the inhabited world, to assemble them for the war of the great and final day of the Lord. So this is what these demonic frog spirits were supposed to do, or going to do. They're going to go and they're going to gather all the leaders of the occupied world and they can turn against Israel. There's a few paras out there that are doing this right now. Okay. But John interjects here and he quotes something from the Gospels. He says, "Look, I am coming like a thief in the night. How blessed are those who stay alert and keep their clothes clean, so that they won't be walking naked and be publicly put to shame." And these frogs gathered the kings to the place which in Hebrew is called Mount Megiddo. Mount Megiddo, Megiddo. All right, so even in Revelations, it's talking a little bit about these frogs in your head and frogs on your bed. Now, the magicians of Egypt, would you like your frog? There you go. All right. Now, these magicians of Egypt saw this and they decided to do the same trick. I don't know if you've noticed, but probably the most prominent, most well-known magician in the world today is a guy by the name of David Blaine. Do you guys know him? How many of you know him? So you guys might know him, David Blaine. He's actually Jewish. Don't know if you knew that. Just like Houdini. Houdini was Jewish as well. So we've taken that sector for ourselves as well. Thank you very much, Egypt. So anyway, so this magician, he's got this new trick that he's been doing for the last 2 or 3 years. I don't know if you've seen it, where he actually swallows live frogs. So this is what he does, right? He gets invited onto these TV channels to have an interview. So he goes onto the TV channel, greets the guy, does the interview, does a few card magic tricks, and just as they're about to end and say thank you, goodbye, he says, "Wait a minute, can I have a glass of water?" Takes a glass of water, drinks the whole glass of water, and regurgitates a live frog. This is what the magicians are doing nowadays. It's pretty cool, by the way. So I know what you guys are doing on YouTube tonight. So this is the thing that he does, which is actually a thing, and it's not just him. It's an ancient thing. Back in the days, there used to be a guy called the human aquarium. He learned how to store goldfish and frogs in his esophagus. Of course, not in your stomach. The stomach acids will cause problem. So they actually train themselves. They train the muscles in their esophagus to close at the bottom, and they teach themselves to go to override the gag reflex so that they can actually get these things down. And then they bring them up. Right? There's different magicians that have different ways of doing this. There's even a guy who took a little mouse and could store a mouse in his esophagus. And then he would smoke, and the smoke actually makes the mouse dizzy, and the mouse just calms there and chills there. And then eventually the mouse comes back out. This is the actual trick that the magicians do. So who knows, maybe Pharaoh's magicians were trying this very trick. But it puts a whole new meaning to the saying, you sound like you have a frog in your throat. Anyone know the origins of that saying? I went to look it up this week because I was very intrigued about this. It's not as cool as I thought it might be. It's just something that someone made up in the late 1900s, because literally when you have a frog in your throat, you know, when you're sick and you've got this voice problem, you literally sound like a croaking frog. That's it. No story behind it. But alas, we have the Midrash. And I found for us a story in the Midrash that tells us that this actually happened in the plagues in Egypt. So let me share that with you guys. What is so bad about the plague of the frogs? I mean, the first plague we can understand was bad because there was no water to drink. Everything turned to blood, right? When the plague came with boils on your body, that's bad. You're suffering with boils. When your animals die, that's bad. What's so bad about a bunch of frogs lying around and jumping around in your head and on your bed? So what? There's frogs everywhere. Stink? Yeah, you can use Axe deodorant, right? What else is a problem? If you make yourself French, you've got free frog legs for life. You can eat some of them. Maybe pick up a frog every now and then, kiss it and see if a prince comes out. So what is the worst thing about this plague of the frogs? The Midrash tells us the very problem, the thing that caused them suffering the most, was the sound of the frogs that drove them mad. Have you guys ever slept next to a dam or a river where there's too many frogs? No, but you've been there, but you never slept because they kept you awake all night. But it wasn't just a normal ribbiting like you were familiar with the frogs. Listen to this. If we read this week's parashah, and we read it hyper literally in the Hebrew, listen to what it actually says in Exodus chapter 8, verse 8. It says the following. Moshe and Aaron left Pharaoh's presence. This is after Pharaoh said to him, please just go and entreat your God to get rid of these frogs. So Moshe and Aaron left Pharaoh's presence, and Moshe cried to Hashem about the frogs that he had brought about on Pharaoh. The frogs are the matter of Pharaoh. Now the word there in Hebrew for the matter of these frogs is the root word dalet veit resh, which spells devar. What is devar or devarim? Words or speech. So the Midrash tells us this should be talking about dibur. So what is the matter of the frogs that he had to go pray about? It was the speech of the frogs Moshe had to go and stop. Have you guys ever seen a talking frog? What about Kermit the Frog? Kermit the Frog's one of them, right? Any ideas? Do you guys think Kermit is Jewish or not Jewish? Why? I say he's not Jewish because who's his girlfriend? Miss Piggy. Alright, so what's up with these frogs? Do these frogs actually speak? What is this devar of the frogs that Moshe and the Torah is telling us about? They didn't actually speak words. Here is what happened. Let me tell you what the Midrash is. But before I do that, I need to first take you to a verse in this parasha as well. 7 verse 29. Exodus 7 verse 29. It tells us exactly, once again we have to read it literally to understand what's going on here and to get to the Midrash as well. Alright, Exodus 7 verse 29 says the following. Alright, the frogs will climb into you, into your people, and into your servants. Literally, into you is what the Torah says. Our translators try and smooth it over and say among you or something like that. But the Hebrew literally says the frogs will crawl into you. So let me tell you exactly how that happened. The Midrash actually clarifies this for us. In Midrash Rabbah, chapter 10, verse 6, it tells us, for the frogs would enter into the Egyptians' bodies and cry out from within them. For it says, Moses cried to Hashem concerning, or literally of the words, because of the words of the frogs that inflicted in Pharaoh. So these frogs went into their bodies, into their throats, and every time they'd open their mouth, like a ventriloquist, they would say, Arabic, Arabic, Arabic. They couldn't speak. This was what was happening to the Egyptians. The frogs were in their throats, and every time they opened their mouth, the frog would say, ribbit. I've heard of a horse whisperer, but never a frog whisperer. Now imagine being an Egyptian. They must be getting the message right now, because even Pharaoh at this point, it's only the second plague, and Pharaoh says, all right, fine, you can have your people go. Just go to your garden, entreat him, and I'll let you guys go. Because put yourself in the shoes of the Egyptians, or the sandals, or whatever they wore back then, Crocs maybe. Put yourself in the shoes of the Egyptians. Just a few moments ago, a few years back, you had a Jewish problem, or an Israeli problem. These guys were multiplying and becoming greater than the Egyptians. And we became worried as Egyptians that they were going to grow so big that they were going to wipe us out as a people. Let's call it genocide. They were worried that the Israelites would come and commit genocide against them. So what did they do with this Israelite problem they had? They decided to enslave them. But there's a problem. When they enslaved us, the more they beat us and the more they hit us, the more we multiplied. Sound familiar? Frogzilla. Once again, the more they hit us, the more they beat us, the more we multiplied. And they must have been noticing this, right? What happens next? Okay, so they have to come up with a new solution to deal with this Israelite problem of theirs. So they decide to kill all of our newborns and throw us into the Nile. That's literal genocide, by the way, in case you guys don't know the definition, which seems to be a problem in South Africa of late. So they actually went and did that. And the Nile ran red with the blood of Jewish newborns. This is why the very first plague that Hashem sends to them is the water turning to blood. To remind them that this is payback for what they did to our children. That blood that they threw into the Nile, now the whole Nile is turned to blood and they can't drink water. It's to remind them of the sin that they had done. But then what happens in the next plague? After we've already reminded them about them killing our firstborns, or killing our infants. The second plague, frogs emerge from the Nile. If you're an Egyptian, and you believe in all these dark arts and magical beliefs, you start believing in reincarnation as well. And you start thinking, oh no, all those Jewish infants we threw in the river are now reincarnated as a bunch of frogs that have come to attack us. And even when we beat the frogs themselves multiply as well, just like the Jews did when we tried to enslave them. And then to drive the point home even further, what does Hashem do? He sends those very frogs into their throats. And the Midrash tells us the frogs literally cried out from within them. Cried out from within them. You'll notice when you read through the 10 plagues that every time Pharaoh tells Moshe to go and pray to God, he uses the word to entreat God. I think it's Ve'atir in Hebrew. But only with this plague with the frogs, when Moses goes to pray to God, it uses a different word. It uses the word Vayitze'ek, which means to cry out to God. Specifically on this one, he cried out to God. Which should mean something to us, because if you're reading the story as we were busy with here in the beginning of the Exodus, that is a very loaded word. Because who cried out to God in the first place in the story? The children of Israel. When the labor was so harsh and the slavery was so harsh, we cried out to Hashem. Let me just read it to you guys again so we can drive this point home. It's in Exodus chapter 2, verse 23 and 24. It says, sometime during those many years, the king of Egypt died, but the people of Israel still groaned and cried out under the yoke of slavery. And their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God acknowledged them. He heard our cries. That's why God came and saved us out of Egypt. So what's happening here is that God took the frogs, put them in the throats of those very Egyptians, and made them cry out. Which means what? Then God remembers the covenant he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Out of the very mouths of the bad guys in the story, the ones that were trying to get rid of us, they themselves ended up singing the praises of Israel. It reminds me of a different story in the Torah with another talking animal, Balaam and his donkey. Remember that story? The exact same premise. He tried to come and curse Israel, but God took the curses out of his mouth and placed within his mouth the blessings upon Israel. So much so that today we remind ourselves on a daily basis when we say the Ma Tovu at the beginning of every service about that miracle. That God will turn the nation's curses against Israel into blessings for us. So we stand at an interesting time here in South Africa at this moment as our country's leaders are at the Hague trying to spread libelous accusations of genocide against Israel, when they themselves are the ones who are in the pockets of the genocidal maniacs of this world. They are friends with the president of Sudan. They don't care about arresting the generals of Rwanda. They are very much chummy-chummies with Putin and pals. And they are there accusing Israel of genocide. Their mouth is trying to curse Israel on the public stage for the whole world to see. How do you guys feel about that, being South Africans? It's disgusting. Yeah, it's as bad as eating a frog. But let's be reminded of what the revelation of John tells us there in the middle of all these frogs coming. And by the way, it's the same story there, right? Those 3 frogs coming out of the 3 mouths of the 3 people went to gather the people from the world to fight against Israel. It's the same thing happening now. But he interjects by quoting Yeshua that says, I will come like a thief in the night. Beware. Keep your clothes clean. Even if our leaders are messing up and sullying their clothes, we need to make sure that our clothes are clean. And as for them, truth is, we know what's going to happen. The Torah tells us very soon they will be caught with a frog in their throat. And what does that mean? That means that one day those guys themselves, out of their own mouth, are going to be forced by Hashem to sing the praises of Israel. I can't wait to see that on our next family meeting. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom.